had been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy from the long drive. The highway stretched out in front of me, nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional sign pointing to a motel or a gas station. When I saw the sign for Whispering Pines Motel, I decided it was time to pull over. The rain had started coming down in sheets, and the faint glow of the neon sign seemed like a beacon in the storm. The motel was small and somewhat run down, tucked between two tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The office was dark, but the door was ajar, so I walked in. A bell rang above me as I entered, and a man stood behind the counter. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his hair was thinning. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at me with eyes that seemed far too tired for someone his age. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Room 12, he muttered, tossing me a key. "There's only one other guest tonight, but be careful after dark." I took the key, my curiosity piqued. "Why?" His gaze hardened for a moment before he leaned in closer. "The thing about this place, it's never empty, even when it seems like it is." Confused but not wanting to press, I nodded and made my way to the room. Room 12 was on the second floor, its door creaking as I pushed it open. The room smelled musty, the air damp with the remnants of the storm. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the furniture was old and worn. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As I sat on the bed, trying to shake off the weariness, I noticed something strange, a dark figure standing at the window, staring out into the rain. I froze. The figure didn't move, not even a twitch. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to shake off the unease that had crept into my chest. But as the night went on, the feeling only grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door, soft and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in front of it. I held my breath, my ears straining for any sign of who or what was out there. I opened the door cautiously, but there was no one, just the empty hallway, the dim light flickering overhead. The footsteps resumed, but this time they were inside the room. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps echoed, yet no one was there. The sound grew louder, closer. They were coming from the corner of the room, but all I could see was the darkened space. And then I saw it, a figure, not quite human, but something else. Its eyes were wide black pits, and its mouth stretched into a grin that shouldn't have been possible. It stood there, motionless, just watching me. My legs went numb as I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed as I tried to escape. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped in the room with it. The figure slowly stepped forward, its grin widening. It was so still, so silent, I could barely hear it breathing. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic thumping of my own heart. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, for any way out. But the words were too much, too terrifying. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. The figure took another step toward me, and I thought I would faint from fear. But just before it reached me, it stopped, its head tilting to the side. Its grin faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "You're not the one." The figure backed away, fading into the shadows of the room, as though it had never been there at all. The air became still once more, but the chill lingered. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. I reached for the door handle, my hands trembling, and opened it quickly. But when I looked out into the hallway, I was met with the same eerie silence. The man from the office stood at the end of the hallway, his pale face watching me. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This place wasn't just haunted by ghosts, it was inhabited by something far worse. I didn't stay another minute. I grabbed my things and ran to my car, not looking back. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the distance, I could still hear those footsteps. It was late, well past midnight, when I pulled into the driveway of the Hollow Pines Motel. The neon sign above the office buzzed, casting an eerie glow on the gravel parking lot. The motel was small, tucked away on a lonely stretch of highway, with trees crowding it on all sides. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if the world around the place had been paused. I was exhausted from the long drive and just wanted a place to sleep. I walked into the dimly lit office, where the scent of stale coffee lingered in the air. A woman sat behind the counter, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were alert and calculating. She didn't smile, just handed me a room key with a steady hand. "Room 5. No one else is staying tonight," she said flatly. "Stay inside after dark, and don't open the door for anyone." I nodded, slightly unnerved by her tone, and took the key from her. There was something about her manner, her tone, that felt wrong. But it was late, and I was too tired to question it. Room 5 wasn't fancy. The carpet was stained, the furniture old, and the air thick with dust. But it would do. I locked the door behind me and flopped onto the bed, the exhaustion pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I don't know how much time passed when I woke up to a faint sound on knocking. Soft at first, like someone tapping on the door. I sat up, heart pounding, wondering if I had imagined it. I waited in silence for a moment, and then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the door I had locked. It was coming from the window. I stood frozen, staring at the glass, my breath caught in my throat. No one could have gotten into the room. I hadn't heard anyone enter. Still, the knocks persisted, growing louder, more frantic. I approached the window slowly, my hand trembling as I pulled back the curtain, just enough to peer outside. There was nothing, just the dense forest surrounding the motel, swaying in the wind, and the faint outline of trees stretching into the dark. But the knocking was still there, clear and insistent. It was coming from behind the window. Terrified, I backed away, glancing at the door, but still unsure of what to do. Should I open it? Would I even make it out if I did? The knocking turned into something else, a low scratching, like claws on glass. That's when I heard a voice, faint but growing clearer. "Let me in, ... The voice was distant at first, but then it was right at the window, as if someone or something was standing just outside. It was deep, distorted, and chilling. My body froze in fear, the blood draining from my face. "Let me in," the voice repeated, now louder, more urgent. I grabbed the chair beside the bed and wedged it against the door, trying to steady my trembling hands. The room was suffocating, the air thick with terror. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My head spun. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The light bulb flickered, then went out completely. The temperature dropped in an instant, and I could see my breath forming in the cold air. The knocking on the window had stopped, but now I could hear something else shuffling, like footsteps, just outside. The door rattled, and I jumped back. I held my breath, hoping whatever was outside would go away. But the knocking continued now, from both the window and the door. "Let me in, ... It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were multiple voices, all echoing the same words, all filled with desperation. The door shook as though someone or something was trying to force its way inside. The scratching grew louder, more intense. I stumbled back to the window, heart racing, and pulled the curtain aside once more. But this time, I saw them, figures pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow and wide, their faces twisted in anguish. They were gathered around the window, their hands pressed against the glass. The scratching, the knocking, the voices, they were all coming from them. They weren't human. They were things, creatures, trapped outside, begging to be let in. I rushed to the door, my pulse thumping in my ears. I had to get out. I had to leave. But just as I reached for the doorknob, the door burst open. The woman from the office was standing there, her face contorted in an eerie smile, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You shouldn't have stayed." Before I could react, she stepped aside, revealing the creatures behind her, dozens of them, their eyes wide, their faces contorted in silent screams. They lunged at me, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, staring into the abyss of their empty eyes, and then everything went black. I was on a road trip, heading through a remote stretch of highway, when I saw the motel, the Silent Pines Motel, its neon sign flickering faintly in the dark. Tired and in need of a place to rest, I pulled into the parking lot. The silence was almost unnerving, like the world had forgotten this place existed. The office was small, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I entered. A man behind the counter greeted me with a smile, but something about him felt ... off. His skin was too pale, his eyes too wide. His greeting was far too warm for someone working at this forgotten establishment. "Room for the night?" I asked. He nodded and handed me a key with no hesitation. "Room 3, the key read. Everything you need is in the room. Just remember, stay in your room after dark." His warning was strange, but at that point, I just needed to rest. I thanked him and made my way to room 3. The hallway was dimly lit, the air stale and heavy. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was typical old furniture, a bed with worn sheets, and a television that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Yet something about it felt off, like the room itself was holding its breath. I set my things down and laid on the bed, my exhaustion taking over. But then I heard it, the softest, most delicate whisper. It was faint at first, like it was coming from the walls. I sat up, heart racing, straining to listen. "Help me, ... The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. It came again, louder this time, from the far corner of the room. My eyes darted over to where the sound originated, but the corner was empty. I stood up slowly, walking toward the corner where the voice had come from. The room seemed to grow colder with each step I took. As I reached the corner, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was nothing there, except for a small, old wooden cabinet. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood there, strangely out of place. I opened it, expecting to find some forgotten items from previous guests, but instead, I found nothing except for a small, folded note. I unfolded the note, my hands trembling as I read the scrawled handwriting. "I'm still here. You have to leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. The whispering returned, now louder, more frantic. The room began to shake, the walls groaning, as if they were alive. I backed away from the cabinet, my heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced, my thoughts scattered. What was happening? Who was in here with me? I turned back to the bed, and that's when I saw it, a figure sitting at the foot of the bed, its face obscured by shadows. The whispering stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the room. The figure stood, slowly, its head tilting toward me. "You shouldn't have stayed." The voice was no longer a whisper, but a guttural growl. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting and warping like something not meant to be seen. I ran to the door, throwing my weight against it, but the figure was right behind me. I heard it breathe, its breath cold against my neck. "Leave this place, or you will never leave." With a final push, the door flew open. I bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. When I reached the office, the man behind the counter was gone, leaving only an empty room. The motel was gone, too. The Silent Pines Motel had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of road. But I can still hear the whispers in my mind, calling me back. I arrived at the motel after the sun had long since set, the highway behind me fading into darkness. The River's Edge Motel was small, nestled beside a creek that ran quietly through the woods. The building was weathered, the windows cracked, and the sign above the door flickered erratically in the wind. It looked like the type of place that had long been forgotten by the world. I went inside the office, the bell above the door chiming with a creak. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his eyes dim and his skin pale. His hands shook slightly as he handed me the key, his voice low and strained. "You can stay in room 8, he said, "but don't go out after dark." I gave him a confused glance. Why not? He just stared at me, his lips quivering. "It's best not to disturb the watcher." That was all he said before he turned away, his gaze lingering on something outside the window, far beyond my view. I took the key, still unsettled by the man's strange behavior, and left. Room 8 wasn't much different from the rest of the motel. The furniture was outdated, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, with an unspoken tension. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a motel. As I was about to lie down, I noticed a figure in the window outside. Standing there, motionless, was a tall man dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. His presence was almost suffocating, his posture unnervingly still. I froze, staring at the figure. Was he watching me? I tried to look away, but my gaze kept returning to him. My heart thudded in my chest, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing second. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the door. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Confused and anxious, I returned to the window. The figure was still standing there, but now he was closer. My stomach churned as I realized he was no longer just watching. He was waiting. The whisper of wind brushed through the trees outside, and in the distance, I thought I heard something, a low, guttural voice. It sounded like chanting, but the words were indistinguishable. My skin crawled. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. What was happening? Suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. I rushed to open it, but the knob wouldn't turn. The room felt colder, the walls seeming to close in. The man outside was still there, staring at the window. The chanting grew louder, clearer now. I could make out the words. He watches, he waits, he takes. A chill ran down my spine as I backed toward the bed. The man's face suddenly appeared in the window, his eyes dark and hollow. "You can't leave." His voice was distorted, twisted with malice. Panicking, I tried once more to open the door. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't budge. My heart raced as the figure outside started to pound on the glass, his face now pressed against it. The glass rattled with each blow. In a frenzy, I pulled away from the window, my feet stumbling over the furniture as I backed toward the opposite wall. The air was thick with a sense of dread, the walls vibrating with an eerie hum. Then everything stopped. The pounding ceased, the chanting faded, and the room went completely silent. I cautiously approached the door again, my breath shallow. When I opened it, there was no one outside. The figure was gone. The motel was eerily quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I ran outside into the night, not looking back until I reached my car. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, the figure standing by the edge of the trees, watching me. And that's when I understood. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. It was late when I pulled off the highway, the gas tank almost empty, the tiredness seeping into my bones. The neon lights of a small motel called the Hollow Oak Motel flickered in the distance, its sign barely visible in the thick fog rolling in from the woods. I had no other choice. I needed to rest. The office was old, the kind that smelled like dust and mildew. Behind the counter sat a man, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit that seemed too formal for the setting. His hair was slicked back, his face pale, almost sickly. His eyes locked onto mine as I approached. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he reached under the counter and handed me a key. "Room 7, it said. "Stay in room 7. Don't go near the others," he said, his voice cold. Confused, I accepted the key and walked to the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I was too tired to care. As I made my way to the door, I noticed the hallway was strangely quiet, not a single sound. The motel felt abandoned. When I entered room 7, it was eerily still. The lights flickered once before settling into a dim, yellow glow. The bed was old, but the sheets looked clean enough. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the bed, my eyes scanning the room. Something felt off about the room. The air was too thick, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I lay down, trying to sleep, but the quiet was suffocating. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled with the strange warning the man had given me. I closed my eyes, but then I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails against wood. It came from the wall next to the bed. Soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I shot up, my heart pounding. The room was still, nothing had changed. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The tapping continued, now more insistent, closer. I turned toward the wall, my breath shallowed suddenly. The door opened. A figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette in the dim light. It was a woman, her face hidden in shadow, her body unnaturally still. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it chilled me to the bone. Before I could speak, the door slammed shut. I scrambled to get up, but the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the floor buckled under my feet, and the temperature dropped so rapidly I could see my breath. Then the tapping stopped. I looked at the walls. There were no doors, no windows, just walls closing in on me. My panic surged as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned back to the mirror above the dresser. My reflection distorted, the woman's face now staring back at me. Her eyes were empty. "You should never have come." Her voice echoed, the walls groaning as they shifted again. I ran to the window and tried to break the glass, but it wouldn't break. I screamed, but the room swallowed the sound. The last thing I remember is the reflection in the woman's face. Moving closer, her fingers reaching out toward me, then nothing. I woke up on the gravel outside the motel. The fog was gone, the parking lot empty. The motel had vanished, leaving no trace behind. No sign, no building, just a stretch of empty road. But I know what I saw, and every night since. I hear the tapping, getting closer and closer. I had been on the road for what felt like days. The endless highway stretched ahead, the night sky dark and oppressive. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and I knew I couldn't drive any further. That's when I saw the Pine Ridge Motel, tucked away at the edge of the woods. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the lights flickering as if they were about to die. I pulled into the gravel lot, desperate for rest. The office was small, almost claustrophobic. Behind the counter, an elderly woman sat, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes, a dull shade of gray, flicked up as I entered. "I need a room for the night," I said, my voice tired. She didn't say anything but simply slid a key across the counter. "Room 6, it read. She gestured toward the hallway, and I took the key, making my way to the room. The hall was dimly lit, with faded carpet underfoot. The air smelled musty, like old wood and dust. When I reached room 6, I noticed a strange chill. I shrugged it off and unlocked the door. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it looked clean enough. A bed, a nightstand, a dresser. Nothing too fancy. I set my things down and sat on the edge of the bed. But the room felt ... off. There was an eerie quietness in the air, a stillness that didn't feel natural. I brushed it aside, too tired to worry about it. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall asleep quickly, but as I lay there, the silence grew heavier. Then, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere in the room, but I couldn't figure out where. It sounded like nails tapping against wood, or perhaps a soft knock on the door. I sat up, heart racing. The tapping stopped. I hesitated, then stood and went to the door. I opened it, expecting to see someone in the hallway, but there was no one, just the dark, quiet corridor. I stepped out for a moment, but the silence pressed in around me, too thick to ignore. The tapping resumed. It was coming from inside the room now. I rushed back to the bed, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. And then I saw it, the dresser. The wood was scratched, deep gouges running down its side. The tapping was coming from within the drawers, as if something or someone was trapped inside. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the drawer handle. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. A strange sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the drawer open. Nothing. The drawer was completely empty, but the air felt suffocating. I shut it quickly, my breath shallow. As I turned away, I noticed something in the reflection of the mirror. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. I spun around, but the corner was empty. The room suddenly felt colder. My breath became visible in the air, and I could feel the weight of something unseen, something watching me. I grabbed my bag, my hands shaking. The door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck. The tapping began again. Louder now, frantic, coming from the walls. I turned back toward the mirror, and the figure was there closer. This time, its face shadowed, eyes hollow and dark. Leave. The voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in my mind. Leave now, before it's too late. I turned to the door again, panic rising in my chest. With a final tug, the door opened. I didn't look back as I ran out of the room and into the parking lot. The motel was silent, but I could still hear the tapping, distant but persistent, following me. When I glanced back one last time, the motel was gone. The parking lot, the building, everything was empty. I didn't stop running until I reached the next town. But the tapping, I still hear it. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure in the mirror. After hours of driving, I was exhausted. The only sign of civilization on the long stretch of highway was the rest stop motel. Its flickering neon lights barely visible in the dark. The place looked worn down, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled into the parking lot and entered the small office. The room was dimly lit, and an old man sat behind the counter, eyes focused on a tattered book. He looked up just long enough to hand me a key, wordlessly. Room 13, it read. I wasn't superstitious, so I took it and walked toward the room. It was the only vacancy, and I was too tired to care. The room smelled musty, the walls yellowed with age. The bed was lumpy and uncomfortable, but it was better than nothing. As soon as I closed my eyes, a soft whisper filled the air. Help me. I froze, heart pounding. The room was still. I sat up, looking around. The whisper seemed to be coming from the walls, almost like a distant murmur, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. But then, It came again. Help me. It wasn't the wind. It was closer, urgent, desperate. I jumped out of bed and walked to the door, opening it to the dimly lit hallway. It was silent, but there was an eerie feeling in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting long shadows down the hall. I quickly returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The room felt colder now. The whispers continued, each one louder and more desperate. I turned on the bedside lamp, hoping the light would bring me comfort. But as I stared into the mirror above the dresser, I noticed something strange, a figure standing just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I walked back toward the door, my mind racing. The whispers became more frantic, echoing off the walls, pleading, "Please, help me." The temperature in the room dropped, my breath becoming visible in the air. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't open. The walls seemed to press in on me. I was trapped. I turned to the window, but the blinds were shut tight. The phone on the nightstand was dead, no dial tone. The silence felt suffocating. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. I was about to scream when the door suddenly flew open. The old man from the front desk was standing there, his face pale, eyes wide in fear. "You shouldn't have taken room 13, he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's cursed. No one ever leaves." Before I could react, the room began to shake. The walls cracked and the ceiling groaned under pressure. I could feel the building shifting, like it was alive. Then everything went dark. I woke up outside, lying on the cold gravel of the parking lot. I blinked, disoriented, and looked around. The motel was gonna vanished. There was no sign it had ever existed, no trace of its faded sign or cracked windows. But I still hear it sometimes, the whispers, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they return. Help me. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when I saw the Whispering Pines Motel on the side of the road. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and the building looked old, worn down, but I needed rest. I pulled into the nearly empty lot and went inside the office. A pale woman with wide eyes handed me a key to room 9. She didn't say much, but I sensed something off about her. "Room 9 is the only one left," she murmured. I took the key and headed to my room. The instant I walked in, I noticed a strange chill in the air. The room itself was simpler bed, a small TV, and a faded dresser. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but it was silent otherwise. I tried to ignore the growing unease as I settled into bed, but then I heard it, whispers, soft, almost unintelligible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, sitting up in bed. The room was still. The whispers continued, growing louder. "Help me." My heart began to race. I walked toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. The silence was unbearable, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I returned to the room, locking the door behind me. The whispers came again, desperate and pleading. "Please, ... help me, ... I tried to ignore it, convinced I was just overtired. But as I lay there, the air grew colder. I pulled the blanket tighter, my breath visible in the air. Suddenly I noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser began to fog up, as though someone was breathing on it. Slowly, a figure began to appear in the mista, shadowy figure, standing just behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. But the room was empty. In a panic, I checked the door again. As I touched the handle, the walls around me seemed to shift. The floor creaked beneath me, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Help me, help me." I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The room seemed to close in on me. I glanced at the mirror again and saw a dark figure, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I ran to the door and threw it open, but the hallway outside wasn't the same. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. I turned to run, but as I reached the stairs, the woman from the office appeared at the bottom. "You shouldn't have taken room 9, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "That room is where it all began." Before I could ask what she meant, the building shuddered, and I bolted out the door into the night. I haven't gone back since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, "Help me." I had been driving for hours. The road stretched endlessly before me, the white lines blurring together as I struggled to keep my eyes open. My GPS had long since lost signal, and I had no choice but to follow the old Route 66. It was late too, latent. The thought of another hour of driving with no sign of a rest stop pushed me to pull into the first place I saw. That place was a motel, barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering neon sign that read, "The Last Stop Motel." The place looked abandoned, with an air of rot hanging around it. Still, the exhaustion in my bones made me desperate. I parked in the lot, which was empty, except for a single car in the far corner. I walked toward the office, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease that settled in my stomach. The door opened with a creak, and I was met by a man behind the desk. His clothes were old-fashioned, his hair unkempt. He looked at me with sad, tired eyes, like he had seen too much and wanted to say nothing more. His voice was low when he spoke. "We have a room for you. Room 7. I nodded, not bothering to ask for anything more. The man handed me the key, one of those old, brass ones, and I took it, barely noticing the cold chill that ran through my fingers as I touched it. The room was nothing special, just a bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. But there was a distinct stench in the air, something sour that made me wrinkle my nose. I pulled the curtains open, trying to get some fresh air, but the outside world felt strangely silent, like everything had been muted. I tried to sleep, but the more I laid there, the more I felt something was wrong. The silence outside was almost oppressive, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and move. When I finally drifted off, I thought I heard something knock at the door. I opened my eyes, but no one was there. I got up, checked the peephole, but there was nothing on the other side. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I went back to bed, only to be woken again by the knocking louder. This time, thump, thump, thump. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. But once again, there was no one there. I stepped into the hallway, now fully awake, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Then, I noticed something odd. The hallway lights flickered, and the walls seemed to shift. The pattern on the wallpaper began to twist, forming faces that seemed to move, whispering, calling out to me. I backed away from the door, trying to shake the disorienting vision from my mind. The silence was deafening again, but something in the air had changed. It felt like the very building was alive, watching, waiting. The knocks came again, but this time they weren't coming from the door. They came from the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the wall beside me, and I heard it whispering voices, pleading, begging for help. A woman's voice cried out, "Let me out." I stumbled back in shock, but something strange happened. The door to my room creaked, open on its own. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step toward it. Inside, the room seemed darker, as if the shadows had taken on a life of their own. I felt an icy grip on my shoulder, and I turned, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me. I ran back into the room, grabbing my belongings, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The room was alive, breathing, like it was closing in on me. And then, I heard the man's voice again, soft and almost soothing. "It's too late." The walls began to shift again, twisting into shapes that resembled faces, twisted, grotesque faces, staring at me, their mouths opening in silent screams. I fled, running out of the motel room and into the parking lot. My heart was racing, my breaths shallow. The neon sign flickered once more, casting a red glow over the empty lot. I ran to my car and slammed the door shut, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was standing outside the motel office, staring directly at me, his eyes hollow and empty. He never blinked. I drove off without looking back, but I knew, deep down, that I had escaped more than just a strange night. The motel had a power of its own, a pull that refused to let go. As I left the road behind, I glanced at my rearview mirror one last time, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw the faint outline of a face, the man watching me leave. My name is Sarah, and I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always chalked up creepy events to coincidence or overactive imagination. But all of that changed the night I stayed at the Desert Mirage Motel. It wasn't a planned stop. I had been driving for hours, my car's engine rattling like it was about to give out. The motel, standing alone in the vast desert, looked like it had been there for decades. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow that made me uneasy. But it was the only place around 4 miles. I checked in, greeted by a clerk who seemed strangely distant. His smile was stiff, like it had been rehearsed. He handed me the key, which was attached to a heavy, rusted metal tag with the number room 13 etched into it. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice flat, void of any warmth. I smiled politely, though a wave of discomfort settled in my chest. I thought about asking for another room, but something told me I was being ridiculous. After all, it's just a motel, right? The room itself wasn't much better. Flickering fluorescent lights cast an unsettling glow across the chipped furniture. The bed was stiff, the blanket threadbare. The air smelled like mildew, and the bathroom door creaked open with a loud groan. I tried to make myself comfortable, but the silence in the room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I took a shower, hoping it would help me relax. But the moment I stepped out of the bathroom, I saw a figure in the corner of the room, just standing there. It was a woman, her features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel her eyes boring into me. My heart raced, and I blinked, but when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. I thought I had imagined it, so I convinced myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched lingered, growing stronger by the minute. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear soft whispers. It wasn't in any language I recognized, just an incoherent murmur, like voices trapped behind the walls. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing unease. Then, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single sound, the creaking of the bed. I opened my eyes, but nothing was there. Yet, the mattress beneath me was moving, as though something invisible was shifting it from side to side. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck. Panicking, I rushed to the window and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut. Suddenly, the light flickered again, and I saw her, the woman, standing in front of me now, her face clear and unmistakable. Her eyes were black, empty, soulless pits of darkness. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just the whispers, growing louder, becoming maddening. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The room began to spin. The walls closed in, and I felt the suffocating pressure of the air around me. And then, it all stopped. I woke up in my bed, the morning light streaming through the window. My heart was still racing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Had it been a nightmare, or had it been real? I rushed to the motel office to check out. The clerk looked at me with the same lifeless gaze. "You stayed in room 13, didn't you?" he asked, almost knowingly. I nodded, my voice trembling. "That room is cursed," he said. No one ever stays there more than one night. I turned and ran, not bothering to ask any more questions. I had to get out of that place. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, I saw her reflection, the woman, standing by the side of the road, her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew then that she was never going to let me go.